As Canadians, it is a crucial element of our citizenship to understand the beginnings and origins of this land prior to European settlement. As learners and students in English First Peoples 11, this contextual understanding is fundamental in analyzing Indigenous literature and media in depth. To construct this context, we use this first course unit to explore an overview of Indigenous culture, history, and society. In this video, we will tap into resources such as text, online media, film, law, and news to build a strong understanding of key components of the relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples. Generally, humanities education can often feel quite disconnected and unrelatable to students. While it is important, learning about topics relating to the United States and Europe can sometimes feel detached and distant. In stark contrast, the first subunit of our context building allows us to tap into the history and culture of the precise land we stand on today, the Comox First Nation. The Comox First Nation consists of 4 formerly separate tribes: Sathlut, Sisitla, Aixen, and Hahe. The Pentlatch people within near proximity also had a similar culture, though they speak a dissimilar language and have unique origin stories. According to the KFN website, the history of Comox began with the arrival of ancestors following the last ice age. They became one with the land, harvesting and managing the rich and natural resources, while the lands and waters supported the culture of the people. Like many other Indigenous peoples, European contact introduced the Comox First Nation to disease and much more warfare. Colonial policies were created to alienate KFN people.
My name is Nicole Rempel, elected chief of the Comox First Nation, and I do not have a traditional name due to colonization and the effects of the Indian Act and subsequent laws. A lot of our tradition and culture was lost, and we're just now working through trying to get that regained in our community.
Today in the Comox First Nation, constant efforts are being made in order to revitalize traditions and ideas that have been close to extinction as a result of European colonialism. Languages are being taught to new generations of people, dances and songs are being preserved through songkeepers, and local school districts have integrated the KFN into their education.
Why don't we write down our history?
We have always had a lot of people who were speakers and leaders that told stories and gave us our history through the spoken word. We hear stories over and over again to help us to understand why things come to be or why things happen the way they are now.
Oral narratives and traditions are a key element of not only Comox, but Indigenous culture as a whole. They are a sacred method of transmitting information, teachings, stories, and hold cultural, historical, and spiritual importance.
Is there any other way that we could have recorded our history?
Yes, we have other ways of recording our history. Once we encountered the Europeans, we had to start recording our history using the wampum belts, because we started having agreements, making agreements with them, and the only way that we were able to remember both sides, they were writing it down and we were recording it in our wampum belts.
Oral traditions are a layered and structured process. Some stories or teachings are kept exclusive to select audiences or people. Stories are often dramatized or altered to portray a specific lesson or to be more fitting to the people listening.
You know, as Indian people, we have no writing to preserve our history, so we put it on a totem pole and we have names to remember certain things, and we sing about it just like a ballad.
This process is much more than just knowledge or story. It is held to a very high regard. To be present during a story is considered to be a great gift. Storytelling and oral traditions have been greatly harmed by colonialization and assimilation. Though in today's Canada, we have been progressing and have even moved to validate oral storytelling and tradition as admissible evidence in law and legal settings.
In the G'dan Max Hall, the walls have pictures and quotes from their leaders involved in the Delgamuukw case. They are remembered for their contributions. Speakers at the event shared how the nations presented their evidence in Wet'suwet'en and Gitxsan languages, sharing their oral histories.
In 1867, the Canadian government created the Indian Act with the intention of regulating and controlling the lives of First Nations people. Though it has had several amendments, the Act in its near entirety is still in effect today. Some of its current clauses include outlining who has Indian status and having complete control over the will of a deceased status Indigenous person. The Act is and has been extremely detrimental to the lives of Indigenous people. Its sexist, limiting, discriminatory, and inhumane policies have been of harm ever since it was put into place. It introduced residential schools, prohibited Native languages, limited Indigenous political action, and made Indigenous people separate from society and subjects of the Canadian government. Today, many efforts continue to create amendments and changes to the Act. Some even work towards seeing full abolition of the Act entirely.
But he continued to talk about the current imperative that another generation of First Nations children not have to grow up under the shadow of the Indian Act. As a father of 2 daughters, he wants to live to see the day when their existence is no longer legitimized by assigned numbers or dictated by the federal government, effectively making them wards of the state. Alvin believes it is not up to the government to determine who is Indigenous and who is not. Belonging is not theirs to give.
A chapter of Canadian history that was ignored and swept under the rug for many years, and an element of the relationship between Canada and First Peoples that may pose uncomfortable question and conversation. The residential schools that were set up and supported by the Canadian government in the 20th and 21st centuries were made to assimilate, harm, control, and suppress the culture of Indigenous children. As the last school closed in 1996, residential schools remain a harmful and extremely impactful trauma on generations of Indigenous people.
He heads one of Canada's 69 Indian residential schools, scattered in key locations as far north as the Arctic Circle. They've a total of 11,000 pupils, orphans, convalescents, those who live too far in the wilderness to get to a daily school.
Indian Horse, a novel by Richard Wagamese and later adapted into film by Stephen Campanelli, portrays a fictional yet realistic telling of Saul, an Indigenous boy that lives throughout the era of residential schools. As he discovers his love of hockey, he simultaneously realizes that society is not set up for him to thrive. The film acknowledges and depicts uncomfortable yet true ideas. It presents the life of this Indigenous boy in its entirety and does not shy away from the adversity, abuse, and trauma that he faces along the way. Indian Horse is a powerful and meticulous film that serves an important significance to creating awareness surrounding this dark part of history. Unafraid to touch upon the tragic details, this film is a valuable and important watch for all Canadians. In June of 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission created 94 calls to action, a specific and meaningful collection of clauses that outlines precise actions that the government can take to reconcile and resolve its relations with First Peoples. In 2018, CBC News launched a website under the name Beyond 94 that tracks the progress of each of the 94 calls in their respective categories. As it stands today, 13 actions have been completed, 29 have projects underway, 32 have proposed projects, and 20 have yet to have been started. In an article by Alicia Elliott, she speaks to the complexities of Indigenous identity and the new cultural abundance in Canada during what she calls the Indigenous Renaissance. Elliott also reflects on her own mixed heritage, the legacy of family abuse, and the societal factors contributing to mental health struggles within Indigenous communities. Despite signs of progress, Elliott emphasizes that true change requires a fundamental shift in non-Indigenous attitudes and systems, challenging readers to confront their own opinions. Ultimately, she argues that reconciliation hinges on non-Indigenous Canadians adopting Indigenous perspectives rather than expecting Indigenous people to conform to dominant norms. All in all, by delving into a comprehensive exploration of Indigenous culture, history, and society, we now have the necessary foundation to approach Indigenous literature and media with sensitivity, insight, and respect. Through the utilization of various resources, we aim to cultivate a deeper understanding of the intricate relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples, fostering meaningful education and dialogue, and promoting reconciliation for the future.